You are standing at the edge of the Nile, on a morning that should feel like any other. Except the water at your feet is turning red, and the fish are starting to float. A woman with a clay jar has just stopped lowering it into the water. A priest upstream has dropped his offering bowl into the current. Moses is on the bank with a wooden staff in his hand. And Pharaoh, in his striped headdress, is watching the river of his own country turn to blood without moving. You have heard the 10 plagues of Egypt before. You may have even memorized them in order. What you probably were not told is that every one of them was aimed at a specific Egyptian god by name. And the Bible itself tells you so in one sentence most people read straight past. The Nile was not just a river in Egypt. The Nile was a god. His name was Hapi. And what you are watching this morning is not a natural disaster. It is the killing of a god. In Exodus chapter 7 verse 20, the text says every drop of water in the Nile was turned into blood. The God who fed Egypt, who flooded the land green every spring, who was pictured with a belly heavy with water and jars in his hands. He is bleeding out in his own riverbed. And the king who was supposed to be his partner is just standing there, watching it happen. That is plague 1 of 10. Each one will hit a different god. The 10 plagues of Egypt were not 10 random disasters. They were a courtroom case. A god-by-god dismantling of Egyptian religion. And Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, tells you so in one sentence. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. The Bible hands you the key to the whole sequence before the 10th plague even begins. The Hebrew word for the plagues in this passage is makot. In its original context it did not mean disaster. It meant blows, strikes, hits in a fight. 10 hits on 10 gods in order, climbing the Egyptian pantheon floor by floor. Think about what the Nile meant to Egypt for a second. Egypt was a ribbon of green in the middle of a desert. That ribbon existed because the Nile flooded every year and laid down fresh black soil. No flood, no food. No food, no Egypt. So the Egyptians worshipped the river itself. They gave it a name and a face and a temple. Hapi was how they thanked the water for keeping them alive. If you have ever watched something you counted on collapse, something you assumed would always be there, you know what that riverbank felt like. The plagues are a story about what happens when the things the civilization trusts to hold it up turn out to be hollow. If the first plague killed the god of the Nile on the first morning, and the magicians of Pharaoh could not even replicate the third plague, what broke inside Egypt's religious establishment on the day the dust of the ground turned into gnats? Plague 2 came up out of the same river that had just turned red. Frogs, everywhere. In the ovens, in the kneading bowls, in the beds. Exodus chapter 8 says they covered the land of Egypt. Frogs were sacred to Heqet, the frog-headed goddess of fertility and childbirth. Egyptian women wore Heqet amulets when they went into labor. She was supposed to be the goddess who brought new life. Now her sacred animal was a national infestation. Every home in Egypt was ankle-deep in the symbol of the fertility goddess. Here is where the story gets strange. Pharaoh's magicians, the top tier of Egyptian religious professionals, tried to match the miracle. And they succeeded. They made more frogs, which did not fix the problem. It made it worse. Then came plague 3. Moses told his brother Aaron to strike the dust of the ground, and the dust turned into gnats, swarms of them. Every grain of dust in Egypt became an insect crawling on skin. The target this time was the earth itself. Some scholars also tie this plague to the purity standards of the Egyptian priesthood. According to Herodotus, Egyptian priests shaved their bodies every other day and kept themselves meticulously clean so that no lice or other vermin would be on them while they served the gods. A plague of gnats would have made the priests ceremonially unfit to approach their own altars. One plague, 2 functions. The god of the ground humiliated, and the priests themselves made ceremonially unclean. Pharaoh's magicians tried to replicate this one too. They could not. And they stopped and said something remarkable to Pharaoh. In Exodus chapter 8 verse 19, they tell the king, "This is the finger of God." Imagine the professional class of an entire religion standing in front of the king and telling him, in so many words, "We cannot help you anymore." That is what plague 3 is. Plague 4 is where the story changes shape. Before it, the plagues hit all of Egypt. After it, the plagues have a property line, and only God can draw it. Exodus chapter 8, verse 21, brings swarms of flies on Egypt, thick clouds of them, filling the houses and ruining the ground. The target was the scarab beetle gods of Egypt, especially Khepri, who was pictured as the rising sun pushing the morning into the sky. But here is the new thing. Verse 22 says the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared. No flies, not one. A visible, invisible line appeared straight down the middle of Egypt that morning, and the flies stopped when they reached it. Plague 5 made the line unmistakable. In Exodus chapter 9, a sickness hits Egyptian livestock. Cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, herds, flocks, dead. Every Egyptian animal, gone. And the text says, Israelite livestock did not lose a single head. This one hit two of Egypt's largest gods at once. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love and fertility, and Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, who is considered a living god, walking the earth. The Egyptians kept the reigning Apis bull in a temple, fed it from gold bowls, and mourned its death like the death of a royal. On the morning of Plague 5, both gods were on the ground in the pastures, with nothing separating the Egyptian cows from the Israelite cows, except an invisible line God had drawn. Picture a wildfire that refuses to cross a specific street. Cars on one block burn, cars on the next block are fine. The people on the green side of the line did not earn their way there. They just happened to live in Goshen. If you have ever been the one who got spared when the people around you did not, you know how uncomfortable that line is. The Bible does not hide from it. It names it plainly. If this is giving you new eyes on a story you thought you knew, share this video with someone who reads their Bible and ask them which god they think the next plague hit. The pantheon is only halfway down. If Egypt's cattle gods were already on the ground by Plague 5, what did Plague 6 do to the gods who were supposed to heal the people Egypt had left? Plague 6 came from a handful of ash. Moses threw soot from a furnace into the air in front of Pharaoh, and boils broke out on every Egyptian body, human and animal. Exodus chapter 9, verse 10. The target was Egyptian medicine. Imhotep, the deified royal physician who had become the god of healing. Isis and Sekhmet, the goddesses associated with medicine and protection from disease. Egypt had a full pantheon of healers, and they had all just failed their own country. The text adds one specific detail in verse 11. The magicians could not even stand before Moses because they themselves were covered in boils. The religious establishment that had conceded professionally at Plague 3 was now physically defeated. They could not even show up in the room. Plague 7 came from the sky itself. Hail, mixed with fire, the worst storm in Egyptian history. Exodus chapter 9, verse 24. Egypt worshipped the sky as Nut, a goddess whose body they pictured as the heavens arched over the land. The sky was a deity bent over them, and that deity was now dropping fire on their heads. Many scholars also connect this plague to Set, the Egyptian god associated with storms and chaos. Here is where a new crack appears inside Pharaoh's government. Verse 20 says, some of Pharaoh's officials feared the word of the Lord, and pulled their servants and their livestock inside before the storm hit. Other officials left theirs in the fields, and those died. Do you hear what happened in that verse? The king's own staff are now hearing Moses faster than the king is. Stop and picture the stillest courtroom you have ever been in. That is Pharaoh's throne room by Plague 7. When the people closest to power start fearing something more than the person in charge, the center has already shifted. The text is showing a regime losing its grip one official at a time. If some of Pharaoh's own officials were now obeying Moses, what finally made his court openly beg him to relent? Plague 8 came on an east wind, locusts, enough to darken the ground of all Egypt, says Exodus chapter 10, verse 15. They ate every green thing that the hail had left. The targets were the grain and harvest deities of Egypt, including Senehem, a locust-headed god invoked for protection against pests, and Osiris, who was associated with vegetation and the annual cycle of the crops. This is the plague where Pharaoh's own court finally breaks ranks in public. In verse 7, his servants turn on him directly and say, do you not yet know that Egypt is destroyed? This is not whispering behind closed doors. This is the inner circle telling the king to his face that he has lost the country. And then came Plague 9, 3 days of darkness. Not ordinary darkness. Exodus chapter 10, verse 21, calls it a darkness that can be felt. To understand what this plague meant, you have to understand that the Egyptians did not think of the sun as a thing in the sky. They thought of it as a god on a journey. Ra, the chief god of the entire Egyptian pantheon, sailed across the sky every day in a solar barge. For 3 days, his barge stopped. The supreme god of Egypt was absent from his own sky. And verse 23 adds the line that had become the pattern of the story. All the people of Israel had light where they lived. The Goshen line still held, even when the sun itself was gone. Stop and think about what 3 days of darkness meant to Egypt specifically. Not to you, to them. The sun god had lost the sky. Read that sentence again. There is a kind of silence that settles in when the thing you thought was permanent goes missing. Egypt lived inside that silence for 3 days, while a village on the other side of an invisible line still had mourning. If every major god of Egypt was already on the ground by the end of Plague 9, what god was left for the 10th plague to strike? And why did that final god have to die in a bedroom? 9 gods had already fallen by the night of the 10th plague. Egypt had 1 god left standing, and he was sleeping in the palace. You have to understand Egyptian royal theology to feel what Plague 10 did. The Pharaoh was not a king with divine rights. He was a living god. The Egyptians believed the reigning Pharaoh was Horus on the throne, a deity walking the earth in a human body. And his firstborn son was the next Horus, the deity in waiting, the god who would take the throne when his father's body finally died. So when Exodus chapter 11 and 12 describe the death of the firstborn, they are not describing random tragedy. They are describing the final name on a list. Every firstborn in Egypt would die that night, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on his throne to the firstborn of a slave girl behind the grinding wheel. And with them, the divine heir, the god who was supposed to come next. Notice what is different about this plague. Every other time, Israel was spared automatically, no action needed. You lived in Goshen, and the plague did not cross the line. For Plague 10, that changes. Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 14, lays out the instructions. Take a lamb, keep it 4 days, kill it at twilight, put its blood on the doorframe with a bundle of hyssop, eat the meat roasted, wait inside until morning. This is the only plague Israel had to actively participate in. Every other time, Goshen was a free zone. This time, blood on the door was the difference between life and death. And God named this night Passover and told them to remember it every year for the rest of time. There is a difference between being kept safe and being asked to step into your own rescue. The Passover is the second kind. That is why this plague, and only this one, became a yearly feast. It is the one where the story became the readers to enter. Exodus chapter 12, verse 30, says there was not a house in Egypt where someone was not dead. And in the palace, the living god of Egypt was kneeling by a small bed, holding the heir, who was supposed to be the next living god. Think about what that meant for Pharaoh. He was not just a grieving father. He was a deity who could not protect his own household. The god at the top of the pantheon was the last name on the plague list, and the divine heir did not live to see morning. Here is the picture to carry out of this story. The plagues of Egypt were a 10-count indictment, climbing a tower floor by floor. The Nile was floor 1, the sun was floor 9, the throne was floor 10. By morning, the tower was on the ground. The man who built it was sitting in the rubble with his son in his arms. That is what Exodus chapter 12, verse 12 was telling you the whole time, in one sentence, before the first frog ever left the water. The scholar John Currid, in his work on Egypt and the Old Testament, lays out this pattern, plague by plague. And James Hoffmeyer, in his archaeological studies of Israel and Egypt, reads the plague narrative within a concrete Egyptian historical setting. Not every scholar agrees on which god lines up with which plague, and some identifications are debated. What is widely recognized is that Exodus 12, verse 12, frames the plagues as a judgment on the gods of Egypt, and that the sequence engages Egyptian religion directly, rather than functioning as random disasters. The reading is not on the fringe. It is what a careful reader of Exodus 12, verse 12, finds already in the text. If every god named in this story was on the ground by the time the sun came up the next morning, what exactly did a slave people see when they stepped outside their doors in Goshen and started walking past the rubble of a pantheon? By sunrise, the courtroom was empty. The verdict was in. The river, the frogs, the dust, the flies, the cattle, the boils, the hail, the locusts, the darkness, the firstborn. 10 hits on 10 gods, in order, climbing the Egyptian pantheon from the water to the throne. And in Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, God tells Israel that the month of the Passover is the beginning of months. The indictment was also a new calendar. The night the last god of Egypt fell was the night a new year began for a people who had never had one. The things a civilization trusts the most are the first things a true reckoning goes after. Egypt did not lose its buildings. Egypt lost its gods. 10 plagues, 10 gods, one verdict. Egypt did not lose a war that night. Egypt lost a pantheon, and the man who was supposed to sit on top of it was holding a child who would never grow up to take his throne. Subscribe for more Bible explainers.